Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Often I like to explore unusual or influential retro tech. This time, though, we'll restore a fairly mainstream computer from its era, but then give it several modern upgrades. The Macintosh Quadra 605 wasn't really anything special when it was introduced in late 1993. Its base specifications were the same as the LC and Performa 475 models, with a 25 MHz Motorola 68LC040 processor, 4 MB of built-in RAM, and an 80 MB hard drive. The only differences between those machines was really just where they were sold. The LC475 was for the education market, and the Performa version was sold in electronics and department stores. The Quadra 605 specifically was targeted more at the professional market, along with other models in the Quadra line, and was generally sold through Apple dealers. It was a bit unique in that while its internals were the same as its counterparts, its case was slightly different, sitting flat on a desk atop 4 distinct feet, whereas the LC and Performa versions resembled previous models with a distinctive upward slant. That's not to say the 605 is any less entry-level than the others. It has a decent selection of ports with audio in and out, ADB, SCSI, 2 serial ports, and video output. But unlike higher-end machines at the time, which could be powered on from the keyboard, it lacked soft power circuitry, so one had to flip the main switch on the back. It was meant to be a basic productivity computer, and its price reflected that. The computer alone sold for about $1,000 US, and one could pick up a bundle, including a monitor, modem, and software for about $1,500. Pretty comparable to similar Windows PCs at the time. But its simple nature also now makes it an excellent machine for those new to retro Macs. This one was given to me as not working. It was said to power on but would never display anything on screen. I was glad to see that its clock or PRAM battery had been removed, as those tend to leak and seriously damage the motherboard. But while most Macs don't need that battery in order to boot, the 605 won't produce video without one. Could that be all this machine needed? To test it out, I grabbed one of my period-accurate Mac monitors. It's somewhat generically named the Macintosh Color Display and features a 14-inch Sony Trinitron CRT. This one seems to have been used at a school based on its markings, and bears some dings and scratches from use. This asset tag on top has been solidly glued on, and I decided not to attempt removing it as plastics from this era have become very brittle, something we'll encounter again soon. But the most important thing is that this monitor still works quite well. When I started the Quadra, it did produce the normal startup chime, but despite the new battery, the monitor remained dark. I suspected bad capacitors on the motherboard could be the problem, but a cursory look showed no obvious signs of leakage. Instead, I stumbled on a much more straightforward culprit. Most Macs from this era included video memory or VRAM soldered to the motherboard, but it turns out this model is a little different in that VRAM modules have to be populated in these slots, which happen to be empty. I dropped in a couple of spares, and sure enough, that did the trick. The display sprung to life. If I didn't have those extra ones, it would have been possible to order new replacements, as there are a few folks in the retro Mac community producing them. 4 MB of RAM was standard with this model and came soldered to the motherboard. That might have been enough at its launch, but someone had installed a later OS, System 753, which had higher memory requirements, which leaves less than 2 MB free for applications without having to resort to virtual memory. An upgrade was in order, and I found a 4 meg module that I could drop into its single RAM slot. 8 megabytes total gives a lot more breathing room. I wanted to wipe the hard drive, which appears to have been swapped in from another Mac at some point. It's got a 350 megabyte SCSI drive made by IBM, which wasn't an option you could choose when the machine was new. It's also got an asset tag from a university in New York, and while I can't say I've ever seen individual components labeled like that, I was somewhat surprised that the drive was even working at all. Many of these older SCSI drives have long since failed. Normally, to reinstall the macOS, I'd need to resort to a stack of floppies or pull out an external CD-ROM drive. But in this occasion, I didn't need either, as I had picked up an external Blue SCSI unit from Joe's Computer Museum for about $50 fully assembled. It plugs directly into the SCSI port on the back of the machine and pretends to be a hard drive. Holding down Shift-Command-Option-Delete when booting instructs the Mac to skip the internal hard drive and start up from the Blue SCSI instead. I had set this one up with all sorts of useful utilities and software installers to make working on older Macs like these more convenient. I got the internal drive reformatted, which completed without any errors. Then I could kick off an installation of System 7.1, which had originally shipped with this model. It uses even less RAM than System 7.5 and generally seems to be slightly more responsive. Ultimately, this machine would end up going out to Free Geek Twin Cities to be sold at their thrift store, so I installed a couple of other useful programs to help its future owner. Copies of the file archive utility Stuffit Expander, as well as disk copy for managing software image files. There was also one more thing I wanted to fix, some damage from our old nemesis, brittle plastic. The top case is held on with 2 latches at the back, and a very common problem with this case style is for one or both of them to break. Thankfully, this one had been taped on to keep it from being lost, but simply gluing it back in place wouldn't suffice. The latches hook into tabs on the bottom case and rely on the flexibility of the plastic to release them. And that flexibility was long gone. So I decided to change the rules a bit. The top case didn't really need to snap on like it originally did, so I sanded down part of the broken off tab so it wouldn't engage with the bottom case anymore. To get at the other tab, I removed the metal shielding from the inside. Looks like this machine might have seen a small liquid spill through its vent holes in the top. There's some rust on the shielding that also stained the plastic, but it doesn't seem to have gotten any farther than that. I got the other latch sanded down too, then set out to reattach the broken one. I used super glue meant specifically for plastics along with some accelerator to help it cure quicker, and while this worked well, I knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. As is often the case with retro tech these days, 3D printing to the rescue. I made a set of repair brackets that could be glued in. They're shaped to fit the underside of the latches to give them support, and will likely work with any of the Mac models that share this form factor. You can find a link to the file in the description. I got them glued into the case, and between the brackets and eliminating the need to bend the latches to begin with, it's unlikely these will ever break off again. One final test, and that was the floppy drive. Did it need any repairs? It did not, which was nice, so all I had left to do was clean the machine up a bit and put it back together. But that doesn't mean we're done with this story. Far from it. I had actually been given 2 machines, and the second one was in slightly better shape, specifically in that both case latches were intact. I gingerly pulled off the top cover to find some differences inside. It had its VRAM modules, but also a RAM upgrade already. This was likely a high-spec machine when it was sold, as it seemed to have its original 250 megabyte Quantum-branded hard drive, the largest offered as an option. In fact, while reviews were generally very positive towards the 605 and its siblings, they did often recommend buying the better configurations. For only a few $100s more, one doubled the included RAM and hard drive space, which was a lot less expensive than upgrading after the fact. And upgrades are exactly what I had planned for this machine. Instead of going for something period accurate, I decided to do a few more ambitious changes to maximize its potential. First was the RAM. It came with 8 megabytes, but I found a 16 meg module to drop in. While this wouldn't hit the official 36 megabyte maximum, 20 megs total would be plenty, so I could turn off virtual memory and not have to wait on the hard drive. Though that hard drive would also get swapped out in favor of an internal BlueSCSI module. I've used these several times before, and for good reason. They're a solid, inexpensive way to replace a SCSI drive with a faster, more reliable microSD card. I had sanded down the latches on the top cover like with the previous machine, but even still, I didn't want to have to remove it every time I needed to access that microSD card. So I turned again to 3D printing, this time designing a custom bracket that would fit in the expansion card opening. It's meant to work with this, an adapter cable I picked up for about $10 that has a microSD connector on one end and a full-size SD card slot on the other. To make everything fit neatly, it's necessary to remove the SD slot from its plastic housing, which is simply clipped on. Then I used some strong double-sided VHB tape to stick the PCB to the bracket. I carefully popped out the expansion cover. Its plastics are likely brittle too, and fed the ribbon cable through the opening. The bracket then just snaps into place and manages to just clear the components on the motherboard. The reason why I'd want easy access to the SD card is because of two new features the BlueSCSI offers, which became available with a firmware update. I was able to reuse the original drive's bracket to hold the BlueSCSI, and then I could snap it into the bottom housing and reconnect the SCSI cable. This short Molex pigtail wouldn't be necessary, as the BlueSCSI can run off the power supplied by the SCSI bus for termination. I got the ribbon cable plugged in, then folded up the excess and used some Kapton tape to keep it neat. The filament I used to print the bracket wasn't a perfect color match, but since it's on the back of the machine, it was no big deal. What is a big deal is how easy the BlueSCSI is to set up and use. A hurdle often encountered by those new to retro computing platforms is how to get an OS and software transferred over. For a long time, this meant needing legacy media like zip disks, or even so-called bridge computers, systems that have interfaces or drives to help exchange files between a modern computer and a retro one. But BlueSCSI has 3 features that make all of that no longer necessary. First is getting an OS installed. The hard drive presented to the retro Mac is really just an image file stored to the SD card. You can make a blank image yourself using a tool like Disk Jockey, which has predefined sizes for various Mac models, or you can define the size yourself. What's even easier is to download a pre-made image. You can pick a blank one so you can install the OS on your own, or just grab one that's already had that done for you. What about software that came on CD-ROM? Machines like this Quadra 605 didn't have a drive built in, and external SCSI drives are becoming increasingly scarce. BlueSCSI has a solution for this too, in that it can emulate being an optical drive. Just copy over a disk image file and name it appropriately so BlueSCSI knows what to do with it. When you reinsert the card and start up the Mac, it'll mount the image as if it was a real disk, and it's especially convenient for playing games. The coolest feature has to do with moving individual files to and from a retro Mac. If you download a program or file from the internet, you can copy it to a special folder on the SD card. Once it's back in the retro Mac, just run the file transfer app to download it into the virtual hard disk. This process cleverly uses the macOS SCSI API to communicate directly with the BlueSCSI outside the hard disk it's presenting. And it's possible to upload files the same way, too. Using this machine was now a whole lot more convenient, but there was one more upgrade I wanted to do. These shipped with a Motorola 68LC040 processor clocked at 25 MHz. That offered a decent amount of performance for its time, but saved cost by omitting a built-in floating point unit, or FPU. That was a kind of math coprocessor, and adding one could make some programs or games perform better. So I dug out one last item from my parts bin, a full 68040 with a built-in FPU. It was clocked at the same 25 MHz, but it's hard to turn down a free upgrade, so I carefully pried the original processor from its socket. I took the opportunity to wipe up the bit of dust that had accumulated, then dropped in the new chip. Sure enough, in the benchmarks, the overall CPU performance didn't change, but the floating point test saw a decent boost. It's possible to overclock these machines to run at 33 MHz, and generally with good results, but it involves desoldering resistors. And everything I've done to this machine so far has been easily undoable if I want to revert to stock. With the mechanical hard drive gone, the only sound from this Quadra is from its lone system fan. I figured I'd swap it out for a modern, quieter replacement, but managed to snap one of the retaining clips in the process.
Of course I did.
Brittle plastic strikes again. And worse, I had made a mistake when ordering, and the new fan was too tall. At this point, I figured I'd just leave well enough alone. I already had replacement capacitors for the motherboard on hand, so I decided to tackle replacing them another day. The first Quadra 605 would end up in the hands of another retro enthusiast, but I wanted to keep the second one for myself. I have a lot of fond memories using similar Macs from its time period, and the 605 specifically has a bit of a cult following among Mac collectors, so it's great to have one of my own. No, it wasn't a high-end machine in its day, but it was a solid one. And with these new upgrades, it's even more capable than ever before. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on social media at thisdoesnotcomp, and as always, thanks for watching.